I may have shared this before, but I'll say it again. In my younger days, I used to think I was a very loving person. I thought I had lots of love for people. That is until I started taking my faith seriously, started reading the gospel seriously. And I got to this particular verse we have today that sort of challenged me, that perhaps reminded me I have some areas of growth, that perhaps I'm not as loving as I thought, and there's a lot more love that I can grow into. A little line where he says, "Oh, so you love those who love you. Well, whoop-de-doo." That's a loose translation, by the way. You love those who love you back, but what about loving your enemies? Well, at first I got through that loophole of, I don't really have people I list as my enemies. But it started to challenge me that, first of all, I was thinking about the people that I think I'm pretty loving towards in my life, and realizing that most of those people are nice to me, are kind to me, and so it makes it easy to love them. But I'm doing pretty well because I don't have enemies. But then I heard a priest once say, the implied commandment in love your enemies is love the annoying and pray for those who drive you crazy. And all of a sudden I had a really long list of those people. There's a lot of growth of love in my life. There's a lot of people I need to learn to love more in my life. That we're called to this higher form of love, and to start loving even those who drive me crazy, to act against my inclinations to avoid those people. Lent is coming up, by the way, and a very good penance to consider is that annoying person in your life, whether from work or school or wherever else, invite them over to your house for dinner and be kind to them and serve them a meal. Though if people start inviting me over for Lent for dinner, I would be a little suspicious. But you're welcome to invite me over still. But of course, then Jesus calls us to go even deeper with this love. He's calling us to this deeper, this higher love. We began the Sermon on the Mount, or early on in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, he calls us to be light of the world and salt of the earth. Then as Jesus continues through the Sermon on the Mount, he's unpacking sort of the nuts and bolts of what does that mean, what does that look like, the rubber hits the road. That sounds nice, to be light of the world and salt of the earth, but what does that look like? That's where Jesus starts to go deeper. As we heard last week, it's not just about not killing your neighbor, as in the Ten Commandments, but not even holding that resentment in your heart. Going deeper to the transformation of the heart. And then today, and not just about loving those who love you, but what about those who don't love you? So even further than just loving the annoying, also loving those who hurt me. How do I respond in love? And that response in love, that is, still willing the best good for that person, even when they don't will mine. That's at the heart of love. Love more than an emotion. Sometimes people hear love your enemy and they think of the emotions we have to generate. Well, when someone's hurting me, I don't exactly generate positive emotions towards them. But that's not what Jesus means. It's not about the feelings. That love, ultimately on the deepest level, is an act of the will and a choice to will the good of the other. To still work and labor for their authentic good, even when they very clearly don't necessarily will mine. So how do I love those, even in those places? That what Jesus is driving at too, that it's not just responding to the love in my life, but this deeper uprooting, or this deeper seated love in my heart. That you're not to respond to evil with evil, that you can't conquer darkness with darkness, or hatred with more hatred. But ultimately, the way to overcome is to respond to that hatred with love. To overcome darkness by bringing light to those places, which is not easy. I want to tell two stories of that I think demonstrate that what Jesus is driving at today. The first story is the story of St. Stephen the martyr. You may know the story. It's written out in Acts of the Apostles. There's a man named Stephen who was preaching the Christian faith and giving testimony to this. And of course, the native locals didn't like it, and they dragged him out, and then they stoned him to death, throwing rocks and stones at them. The wondrous thing is, as that was happening, St. Stephen didn't throw out curse words. What did he do? He prayed for them. He said, "Father, forgive them. Do not hold this sin against them." That even in the very act of them killing him by throwing rocks and stones at him, he still willed their greatest authentic good by praying for them. Which I know that's not what I would probably be saying if you started throwing rocks at me. I would probably have less kinder words for you in that moment. But that he was this witness in following Christ on the cross, of course, who on the cross prayed for all of those who were crucifying him. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." And so St. Stephen, as he was being stoned to death. And as this was happening, there was a young man standing there watching, a man named Saul. And it says that Saul watched approvingly as this was going on. And immediately after that, this Saul gets a certificate or a letter giving him authority to go to a place called Damascus to arrest and kidnap and probably torture and execute a number of Christians. And on the way, of course you probably know the story, a great light from heaven, he hears the voice of Christ say to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" He says, "Who are you?" He says, "I am Christ, who you are persecuting." And of course he converts and becomes now who we know as Saint Paul. But I can't help but think, even though it's never explicitly stated by Paul anywhere or said, but I can't help but think that as he was on that road to Damascus, yes, planning on arresting Christians, muttering threats against them, but that he still kept having this nagging image of his head of that Saint Stephen. Stephen who showed this act of love even in his dying moments, who prayed for his enemies in those dying moments. That I can't help but think that was deeply impressed into Paul's memory. And that thinking about that actually opened him up to receiving the voice of Christ into his own life. And that throughout his life, as he faced his own persecutions, that memory came up again and again. And that I can't help but think, but that witness of St. Stephen was at least partly in his mind as he wrote those famous and beautiful words in his letter to the Corinthians about love. That faith, hope, and love endure, and the greatest of these is love. But that love is patient, love is kind. Love keeps no record of wrongs. Love hopes all things, endures all things. Love perseveres, love never fails. I can't help but think that was informed by the witness deeply impressed on him of St. Stephen at the end of his life. And one other brief story. I recently came across the story and the writings of a man named Takashi Nagai. Takashi was a Japanese doctor who married a very devout Japanese Catholic woman who, by her own witness, sort of inspired him to grow in his own faith. He happened to live in a city called Nagasaki during the Second World War. And he was there when the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Of course, devastating, wiping out tens of thousands of people, including his own wife. But that when he found the remains of his wife, he saw that she had a rosary that from the heat had melted onto her hand. She was meditating on the rosary, praying, asking Mary's intercession, and meditating on the mystery of Christ, this Christ who gave his life for us, who taught us these things about loving even our enemies. She was praying in that moment when the bomb fell. And so this man who lost his wife, who saw his city devastated, who lost hundreds of friends and family, thousands of fellow citizens, who has every right to be hateful, angry, resentful, bitter, has every right to hold a grudge against his enemies, it seems. Yet, in his own prayer and reflection, he began to write, and he began to talk to people. And rather than being full of anger and resentment and hatred, he started encouraging people to love your neighbor, love others as yourself. In fact, he went to the rubble of his home and built a small shack where he lived, continued to live, and people would come and visit him. He would write letters, and people were inspired by his words. They would come to him, and he named his little hut, his little shack that he built where he lived, that a Japanese word that means as yourself. It's the idea of love others, following Christ's commandments. Love others as you would love yourself. And that's how he chose to live out the last years of his life, encouraging people, even people who would formerly have been his enemies, not calling curses down upon them, but encouraging people to prayer, encouraging people to love their neighbor. And that he was a leader among his community to helping people to rebuild, but leading them not just to rebuild, but not to fall into darkness of hatred, but to love. And the church has opened up the cause for his canonization, that he's now declared as a servant of God Takashi Nagai. And so Jesus calls us, as we're called to be light of the world and salt of the earth, to be a source of love. Not just to respond to the love we're shown, but to be the source, the fount of love to those places when there is not love. To respond to not love with love. But not just the feelings, as I said, but truly authentically willing the good of the other even when they don't will ours. That we can live into this being the light of the world and salt of the earth. And I don't know about you, but I know I'm not there yet at that level of love. But that's exactly why we come back here again and again, week after week, imbibing this love of Christ, imbibing his sacrificial love into ourselves, this one who gives himself as self-gift, this God who is in his very self perfect self-gift. That there is no selfishness, there's no egoism in God's self. But all of God's self is self-gift. It's part of what it means when we say God is love. The self totally oriented towards self-gift, totally oriented towards the good of the other. So that we may continue to follow this call of Christ, be drawn into his love, be filled with his love, this love that calls us to lose ourselves for the good of others. Amen.